I walked into my parents' backyard last Saturday knowing exactly what was waiting for me. 3 years of planning, 3 years of listening to secondhand reports about what my family really thought of me, and 3 years of building something they never thought I could achieve. The last time I saw most of these people was when I was 32, unemployed, and sleeping on my brother Dale's couch after my startup crashed and burned. Back then, they made their opinions crystal clear. My Aunt Genesis loved reminding everyone how I was the family disappointment who couldn't hold down a real job. My Uncle Rocco would joke about how I was still playing house with my little computer projects while everyone else had real careers. My mom, Lori, would sigh whenever someone asked about me, like I was this burden she had to carry. And my dad, Andrew? He perfected the art of introducing my brother as his successful son and me as just his other son. The thing that really got to me wasn't the criticism itself. I could handle being called a failure or a dreamer. What destroyed me was discovering they were all having group chats about me. My cousin Julie let it slip during an argument that the whole family had been discussing my financial situation behind my back. They were sharing screenshots of my social media posts, analyzing my life choices, and basically treating my struggles like entertainment. When I confronted Dale about it, he admitted that they had a family WhatsApp group called Dale's House Updates, where they were literally tracking my job applications and failed interviews. That was my breaking point. Not the unemployment, not the failed business, but finding out my own family was treating me like a reality show. They thought I was too pathetic to even notice what they were doing. So I disappeared, blocked everyone except Dale, moved across the state, and spent 3 years building the consulting firm they said I'd never be capable of running. Every late night working, every client meeting, every success was fuel for what I knew would eventually happen. They'd want me back for something, and when they did, I'd be ready. The invitation came 2 months ago. My grandmother, Gabriella's 80th birthday party. Mom called personally, which should have been my first red flag. She never calls unless she needs something. She went on about how the whole family would be there, how it had been too long, how Grandma specifically asked for me to come. The guilt trip was masterful, but I could hear the calculation behind it. They needed their perfect family photos, and missing a son would raise questions. I said yes immediately. Mom sounded surprised, like she expected me to make excuses. She had no idea I'd been waiting for this exact opportunity. Walking into that backyard was like stepping into a time machine, except I was the only one who had actually changed. Same personalities, same dynamics, same casual cruelty disguised as family banter. Genesis was holding court near the drink table, already 3 glasses deep into whatever she was drinking. Rocco was grilling burgers and talking loudly about his real estate deals. Julie was showing off engagement photos to anyone who would look. The first hour was almost normal. People were actually being civil, asking generic questions about where I was living, what I was doing for work. I gave vague answers and let them think I was still struggling. It was fascinating watching them exchange those little glances they thought I couldn't see, the same looks they used to give when I was crashing on Dale's couch. Then Genesis started getting comfortable. She always did this at family events, waited until she had a few drinks and an audience, then started her routine. She grabbed my arm while I was getting some food and said loud enough for half the party to hear that the family parasite had returned, asking if I was still living off scraps. The whole conversation stopped. People were staring, waiting to see how I'd react. Before I could respond, Mom jumped in with what she probably thought was helpful commentary. She announced to everyone that I was sleeping in a moldy basement and at least rats have company. The laughter that followed wasn't surprise or discomfort. It was recognition. They'd all heard this material before. That's when I realized this wasn't spontaneous cruelty. This was a performance they'd been rehearsing for 3 years. Dale's fiancé, Tiago, who I'd never met before, actually gasped and asked if this was really the brother Dale had told her about, the one who failed at everything. Dale nodded and pointed at me, explaining that, yeah, I was 35 and still playing pretend adult. More laughter, more recognition. The final moment came when Dad stood up to make a toast. He raised his glass and started talking about celebrating success and family achievements. Then he stopped, looked directly at me, and said he wanted to toast his son's success but realized he was looking at the wrong child. This one was just breathing their oxygen. Uncle Rocco thought this was hilarious. He started going on about how he remembered when they all thought I'd amount to something, calling it the best joke ever. Even Grandma Gabriella shook her head and told me I brought such shame to the family. I stood there taking it all in, watching these people who were supposed to love me treating my life like comedy material. The thing is, I wasn't hurt this time. I was grateful. They were giving me exactly what I needed. I walked over to the gift table where they'd set up all the birthday presents for Grandma. Between a wrapped jewelry box and some flowers, I placed a small USB drive. No card, no wrapping, just a simple black drive that looked like it could have come from anyone. Then I left. Didn't say goodbye, didn't make a scene, just walked out the back gate and drove home. The calls started 4 hours later. 73 missed calls by the time I went to bed. 52 text messages that started with confusion and escalated to panic. Voicemails where I could hear multiple people screaming in the background. Because that USB drive contained 3 years worth of documentation. Screenshots of every family group chat they thought I'd never see. Audio recordings of phone conversations where they discussed my personal life like gossip. Financial records showing exactly how much money they'd been telling people I owed Dale when I'd actually paid him back in full 2 years ago. But most importantly, it contained the business registration documents from my consulting firm, tax returns showing exactly how much I've been earning, and client testimonials that would make it very clear I'm not the failure they've been telling everyone I am. The funniest part? The drive was labeled Family Memories in small print on the side. I'm sure whoever plugged it in first was expecting birthday photos. Right now, they're all trying to figure out how much I know and how long I've known it. They're wondering what else I might have recorded or documented. They're probably going through every conversation they've had about me for the past 3 years, trying to remember what they said and who might have told me about it. But mostly they're realizing that the family joke isn't laughing anymore. Update 1. The response to my last post was incredible. Shout out to the commenter who said my family would try to flip this around and make me the villain. You called it perfectly. What happened next was exactly what you predicted, but somehow even worse. Monday morning, exactly 48 hours after I left that USB drive, Dale showed up at my apartment. I wasn't surprised. I've been expecting this visit for 3 years. What surprised me was that he brought backup. Julie and my mom, Lori, were sitting in his car outside. Dale looked like he hadn't slept, which honestly was satisfying to see. He started talking before I even fully opened the door, saying we needed to discuss what happened at the party and figure out how to handle this situation as a family. The word situation really got to me, like I was some kind of natural disaster they had to manage. I invited him in because I wanted to hear their strategy. Dale immediately launched into this speech about how family members sometimes say things they don't mean when they're drinking or stressed, and how taking those conversations out of context wasn't fair to anyone. He kept emphasizing the word context, like it was some magic word that would make 3 years of group chats disappear. When I asked him what context makes it okay to call someone a family parasite in front of their grandmother, he got defensive. He said Genesis was going through a difficult divorce and alcohol makes people say stupid things. When I brought up the WhatsApp group tracking my job interviews, he claimed that was just family members being concerned about my well-being and trying to figure out how to help. The conversation went in circles for about an hour. Dale would excuse one thing, I'd bring up another example, and he'd find a new way to rationalize it. The financial lies about me owing him money? That was just him being embarrassed about lending money in front of his fiancée. The recordings of phone calls where they discussed my personal life? That was just normal family conversation. What really frustrated me was how good he was at this. Dale has always been the family diplomat, the one who smooths things over and makes everyone feel better. But I could see through it now. He wasn't actually addressing anything I'd said. He was just throwing out explanations that sounded reasonable on the surface. Things shifted when I asked him directly why he thought I recorded those conversations in the first place. His whole demeanor changed. He said he didn't understand why I would secretly record family members instead of just talking to them about my concerns. That's when I realized he was trying to make the recordings themselves the issue, not what was said in them. I told him I started recording conversations 2 years ago when I noticed people were telling me different versions of the same family discussions. Dale claimed he didn't remember those conversations, but I could see him calculating. He was trying to figure out exactly what I had and how much trouble they were all in. The breakthrough moment came when I mentioned the business registration documents on that drive. Dale's face went completely blank. He genuinely didn't know I'd been successful. For 3 years, he'd been operating under the assumption that I was still struggling, still the failure they all thought I was. He asked me directly how much money I was making. When I told him, he actually sat down. It's more than he makes, more than most of our family makes, and definitely more than the fictional struggling version of me they'd been discussing in their group chats. That's when the real conversation started. Dale wasn't trying to manage a situation anymore. He was trying to understand how badly they'd all miscalculated. He wanted to know why I hadn't told anyone about my success, why I'd let them think I was still failing. I explained that I'd tried to tell him about the business 18 months ago when I first started making real money. He'd brushed it off, said something about hoping this one worked out better than the last one. When I'd mentioned some of my bigger clients, he'd changed the subject. The family had already decided I was a failure. and they weren't interested in information that contradicted that narrative. Dale got quiet for a long time. Then he asked if I was planning to share those recordings publicly or send them to other family members. I told him that wasn't my plan, but I also wasn't going to pretend the last 3 years didn't happen. He wanted to know what I wanted from them. This was the question I'd been waiting for. I told him I wanted the truth. I wanted them to admit that they'd been having conversations about me behind my back, that they'd been lying about my financial situation to other people, and that what happened at the party wasn't spontaneous cruelty, but a performance they'd all participated in before. Dale said he could talk to everyone and get them to apologize. I laughed at that. I told him apologies weren't going to fix 3 years of being treated like entertainment. I wanted them to understand what they'd actually done and face the consequences of their choices. He asked what consequences I was talking about. I said I hadn't decided yet, but I was done being the family's punching bag. If they wanted to repair relationships, they needed to start by being honest about what they'd broken. After Dale left, Mom and Julie came up to my apartment. Mom was doing her concerned parent routine, asking if I was okay and saying she was worried about me. Julie was more direct. She wanted to know if I was going to cause problems for Dale's upcoming wedding. The wedding angle was interesting because it revealed how they were thinking about this. They weren't worried about what they'd done to me. They were worried about how my response might affect their plans and their reputations. Julie tried the same approach Dale had used, explaining that family dynamics are complicated and sometimes people say things they don't mean. But then she made a mistake. She said she hoped I understood that everyone was just trying to look out for me in their own way. I asked her to explain how posting screenshots of my LinkedIn profile in a family group chat was looking out for me. She couldn't answer that. Mom jumped in and said family members share things because they care. But even she sounded uncertain. The conversation ended when I asked them both a simple question. If they found out another family member had been recording their private conversations and sharing them in group chats, how would they feel? Neither of them could answer that either. They left promising to talk to the rest of the family about apologizing properly. I told them I'd be interested to see what a proper apology looked like after 3 years of being treated like a joke. Here's what's really bothering me, though. They're still not getting it. They think this is about hurt feelings or miscommunication. They don't understand that I've spent 3 years watching them create a fictional version of my life and then mock that fiction in front of other people. The recordings and documents aren't just evidence of what they said. They're proof that they all knew exactly what they were doing. Those group chats show them coordinating their stories, making sure everyone had the same talking points about my failures. I'm starting to realize that revealing the truth might not be enough. They're already working on damage control, trying to minimize what they did and shift focus to my inappropriate response. Dale's visit wasn't about making things right. It was reconnaissance. But here's what they don't know yet. That USB drive was just the opening move. I've got 3 years worth of documentation, and I'm just getting started with what I plan to do with it. Update 2. You guys predicted this perfectly. The commenter who said they'd try to gang up on me and make me the problem? Spot on. What happened Wednesday night was exactly that. Except their plan completely fell apart. Genesis organized what she called an emergency family meeting at her house. Dale texted me Tuesday asking if I'd come to discuss everything as a family and find a path forward. The formal language was obviously Genesis speaking through him. She's always been the family's self-appointed crisis manager, the one who decides how situations should be handled. I almost didn't go. Part of me wanted to let them stew in their panic for a few more days, but I'd been planning for this exact scenario for 3 years. I knew they'd eventually try to corner me with the whole family present, thinking numbers would work in their favor. Walking into Genesis's living room felt like entering a courtroom where I was clearly the defendant. Everyone was already there. Mom, Dad, Uncle Rocco, Dale, Julie, even Grandma Gabriella. They'd arranged the seating so there was one empty chair facing everyone else. The symbolism wasn't subtle. Genesis started with what she probably thought was a diplomatic opening. She said the family needed to address what happened at the birthday party and figure out how to move forward in a way that respected everyone's feelings. The word everyone was doing a lot of work in that sentence since they'd spent 3 years completely ignoring my feelings. She laid out what she called the family's position. They acknowledged that some things were said at the party that were hurtful and inappropriate. They were willing to apologize for those specific comments. However, they felt that secretly recording family conversations was a violation of trust that was equally problematic. The false equivalency was beautiful. 3 years of group chats mocking my life was somehow equal to me documenting their behavior. Genesis kept emphasizing trust and family loyalty, like those concepts had any meaning after what they'd done. Dad jumped in with his perspective. He said he understood I was upset about the comments at the party, but family members shouldn't be keeping secrets from each other or plotting against each other. The irony was incredible. He was lecturing me about keeping secrets while sitting in a room full of people who'd been secretly discussing my life for years. Uncle Rocco took a different approach. He said everyone had gotten too emotional about this situation and we needed to focus on practical solutions. His solution was simple. I should delete whatever recordings I had, they would apologize for the party comments, and we'd all agree to communicate better going forward. When I asked what better communication looked like, Rocco said it meant bringing concerns directly to people instead of talking behind their backs. I asked if this new policy applied to the WhatsApp group where they'd been tracking my job applications. The room got very quiet. Mom tried to redirect by saying the recordings were making everyone feel unsafe and violated. She wanted to know if I was still recording conversations or if I had recorded anything from the visits Dale and she had made to my apartment. The paranoia was exactly what I'd hoped for. I told them I wasn't currently recording anything, but I wasn't going to promise not to document future conversations either. If they wanted to rebuild trust, they needed to start by admitting the full scope of what they'd been doing behind my back. That's when Grandma Gabriella spoke up. She said she didn't understand what everyone was so upset about because families talk about each other all the time. She couldn't see why I was making such a big deal out of normal family conversation. This was my opening. I asked Grandma if she thought it was normal family conversation when Genesis posted screenshots of my LinkedIn profile with comments about how pathetic my job history looked. Grandma looked confused, so I asked Genesis to explain what she'd shared in the family group chat about my professional life. Genesis tried to deflect by saying those conversations were taken out of context, but Grandma wanted to know what conversations she was talking about. The family had never told Grandma about the group chat because she's not comfortable with technology and they knew she'd disapprove of the secrecy. I pulled out my phone and read some of the actual messages Genesis had sent. Not the recordings, just the text messages from the family WhatsApp group. Genesis commenting on my clothes and photos I'd posted. Dale sharing details about my job interviews that I'd told him in confidence. Julie posting screenshots of my social media with commentary about how I was trying to make my life look better than it actually was. Grandma's expression changed as I read these messages. She asked Genesis directly if she'd really been sharing private information about me with the whole family. Genesis tried to explain that family members share concerns with each other, but Grandma cut her off. She asked why no one had ever mentioned this group chat to her. Dad tried to explain that they didn't want to burden her with family drama, but Grandma pointed out that they'd been discussing her birthday party in this same group chat. She wanted to know what else they'd been saying about family members behind their backs. The meeting completely derailed from there. Instead of confronting me about the recordings, they were all trying to justify the group chat to Grandma. She kept asking pointed questions about who else they discussed and what other secrets they were keeping from her. Dale tried to get things back on track by asking what I wanted from them. I said I wanted them to admit that the group chat wasn't about concern for my well-being. It was entertainment. They were treating my struggles like a reality show and my successes like plot twists they needed to analyze. Genesis got defensive and said that wasn't true, but I had screenshots of her messages. When I was unemployed, she'd sent messages calling it karma for me thinking I was too good for regular jobs. When I started getting interviews, she'd commented that I'd probably mess them up anyway. When I stopped posting on social media regularly, she'd speculated that I was hiding something embarrassing. Uncle Rocco asked why I'd never confronted anyone about these messages when they were happening. I explained that I didn't know about the group chat until Julie accidentally mentioned it during an argument. By then, I'd realized the whole family had been participating in discussions about my private life without my knowledge. Mom tried a different approach. She said families sometimes handle things imperfectly. But the important thing was that everyone loved each other and wanted to fix the relationship. She asked what it would take for me to forgive them and move past this. I told her forgiveness wasn't the issue. The issue was that they'd created a dynamic where I was everyone's entertainment, and now they were upset that I'd documented their behavior. They weren't apologizing for what they'd done. They were trying to manage the consequences of getting caught. The conversation went in circles for another hour. They'd make excuses for the group chat. I'd point out specific examples of cruel behavior, and they'd try to redirect to my inappropriate response of recording them. Julie finally asked the question they'd all been avoiding. She wanted to know if I was planning to share the recordings with anyone outside the family. Specifically, she was worried about Dale's fiancé hearing conversations where they'd discussed whether she was good enough for him. That was news to me. I asked what they'd said about Tiago in the group chat. The silence was telling. Apparently, the family had opinions about Dale's relationship choices too, and they'd been discussing those opinions in the same forum where they'd been mocking my life. Dale looked uncomfortable and asked if the recordings included conversations about Tiago. I told him they included everything from the past 2 years, whenever I'd been part of family conversations where people said one thing to my face and something else behind my back. The meeting ended when Grandma announced she was tired and wanted everyone to leave. But before people started gathering their things, she made it clear that she disapproved of the secret group chat and the gossip it had enabled. She said families should be supportive, not judgmental, and if people had concerns about each other, they should address them directly. As everyone was leaving, Genesis pulled me aside. She said she hoped I understood that revealing family conversations publicly would hurt innocent people and damage relationships that had nothing to do with me. She was trying to make me responsible for protecting the same people who'd been entertaining themselves with my private life. I told Genesis I wasn't planning to make anything public, but I also wasn't going to pretend the last 3 years hadn't happened. If she was worried about people getting hurt by the truth, maybe she should have thought about that before participating in group chats that treated family members like gossip material. The drive home was surreal. I'd walked into that meeting expecting to be ganged up on and lectured about family loyalty. Instead, I'd watched them explain to Grandma exactly how disloyal they'd actually been. Their attempt to make me the problem had backfired completely. But here's what's really interesting. They're still not understanding the core issue. They keep trying to negotiate about the recordings instead of addressing why I felt the need to make them in the first place. They want to manage the evidence without acknowledging the behavior that created it. The best part is watching them realize that their secret group chat wasn't as secret as they thought, and now they're paranoid about what else might be documented. They created this situation by treating family loyalty as a one-way street. Now they're learning what it feels like to be on the wrong side of that dynamic. Final update coming tomorrow. Wait until you hear about the family dinner where everything finally came together. Final update. This is it, guys. The conclusion you've all been waiting for. To everyone who followed this story and called exactly how my family would react, you were right about everything. What happened at Sunday dinner was the perfect ending to 3 years of planning. Grandma Gabriella called me Friday and asked if I'd come to Sunday dinner at her house. She said she wanted the whole family together to discuss what she'd learned about the group chat situation. Her tone made it clear this wasn't a request. When Grandma decides something needs to happen, it happens. I knew this was going to be the final confrontation. The family had spent a week since the emergency meeting trying to figure out damage control, and Grandma had been asking questions they couldn't answer. She'd demanded to see the actual messages I'd mentioned, and they'd been scrambling to explain why they'd kept her out of their discussions. Walking into Grandma's dining room felt different this time. The power dynamic had completely shifted. Instead of me being the family disappointment everyone could mock, I was the person holding evidence of 3 years of their secret cruelty. They all looked nervous, which was exactly what I'd been working toward. Grandma started by addressing the elephant in the room. She said she'd spent the week thinking about what she'd learned at Genesis's house, and she had some questions for everyone. She'd made it clear to the family that she expected honest answers, not the diplomatic explanations they'd been giving her. She asked Genesis directly to explain the family group chat and what had been discussed there. Genesis tried to minimize it, saying it was just normal family conversation, but Grandma cut her off. She said she'd been thinking about family conversation, and she couldn't understand why normal conversation needed to be kept secret from certain family members. That's when I realized Grandma had been doing her own investigation. She'd been asking Dale, Julie, and my parents specific questions about the group chat, and their answers hadn't been matching up. She'd figured out they were still trying to manage the story instead of telling her the truth. Dad tried to explain that the group chat had been created with good intentions, but Grandma asked him to define what good intentions meant. When he said they were concerned about my well-being and trying to figure out how to help, she asked why no one had ever talked to me directly about these concerns. The conversation I'd been waiting 3 years for finally happened. Grandma made each family member explain their participation in the group chat, not their excuses or justifications, but their actual behavior. She wanted to know what they'd said about me, when they'd said it, and why they'd thought it was appropriate. Genesis admitted to sharing screenshots of my social media posts with commentary about how I was trying to make my life look better than it was. Uncle Rocco acknowledged making jokes about my job applications and failed interviews. Dale confirmed he'd shared details about my financial situation that I'd told him in confidence. But the real revelation came when Grandma asked about other family members. She'd realized that if they were comfortable discussing me behind my back, they were probably discussing everyone else too. She wanted to know what they'd said about her, about Dale's relationship with Tiago, about family members who weren't present. The silence was beautiful. They couldn't deny it without lying directly to Grandma's face, but admitting it meant acknowledging they'd been gossiping about everyone in the family behind their backs. Julie finally broke and admitted they'd discussed whether Tiago was good enough for Dale and whether Grandma was becoming too demanding as she got older. Mom confessed they'd shared concerns about Uncle Rocco's drinking and Dad's gambling habits. The group chat wasn't about concern for me, or it was a forum for judging and criticizing every family member who wasn't part of the conversation. Grandma asked if anyone wanted to explain why she hadn't been included in these discussions about her own behavior and well-being. The question hung in the air because there was no good answer. They'd excluded her for the same reason they'd excluded me, because they wanted to talk about her, not with her. That's when I played my final card. I told Grandma I'd brought copies of some of the messages if she wanted to see exactly what had been said. I'd printed out selections from 3 years of group chat conversations, organized by family member with dates and context. The look on everyone's faces when I pulled out those folders was worth 3 years of planning. They realized I hadn't just recorded recent conversations. I'd been systematically documenting their behavior for years. Every cruel joke, every privacy violation, every moment they'd treated family members like entertainment was preserved in black and white. I handed Grandma the folder with her name on it first. She read through messages where they'd discussed her memory, her independence, her financial decisions, and her health concerns. Messages where they debated whether she should be driving, whether she needed supervision, whether they should be making decisions for her without her input. Then, I gave her the folder about Dale and Tiago's relationship. Messages where they'd analyzed every interaction, criticized Tiago's background, and placed bets on how long the relationship would last. Dale's face went white as Grandma read discussions about his private life that he'd never authorized. The final folder contained messages about me. But by then it didn't matter. The pattern was clear. The family group chat wasn't about love or concern. It was about control and judgment. They'd created a space where they could criticize and mock anyone who wasn't present to defend themselves. Grandma closed the folders and looked around the table. She said she understood now why I'd felt the need to document these conversations. She said when family members feel unsafe being honest with each other, someone always ends up keeping records as protection. She announced her decision. The group chat was ending immediately, and anyone who wanted to continue family relationships would need to commit to direct, honest communication. No more discussing family members behind their backs. No more coordinating stories. No more treating private information as gossip material. More importantly, she said anyone who couldn't accept these boundaries was welcome to step back from family events until they were ready to participate respectfully. She wasn't going to tolerate the kind of behavior she'd seen documented in those folders. Genesis tried to argue that family dynamics are complicated, and sometimes people need space to process their feelings about each other. Grandma agreed that processing feelings was important, but she said the difference between processing and gossiping was whether the person being discussed knew about it and could respond. The dinner ended with Grandma asking everyone to think carefully about what kind of family relationships they wanted moving forward. She made it clear that rebuilding trust would require acknowledging what had been broken and making different choices going forward. As people were leaving, Dale approached me privately. He said he understood now why I'd felt the need to document everything, and he was sorry for participating in conversations that had violated my privacy and dignity. He asked if there was a way to rebuild our relationship based on direct communication instead of family politics. I told him I was willing to try, but it would require him being honest about his motivations. I wanted to understand why he'd felt comfortable sharing private information about me with people who were using it to mock me. We agreed to have that conversation without the rest of the family present. Genesis, on the other hand, approached me to say she thought I'd manipulated the situation and turned Grandma against the family. She said families need private space to discuss concerns, and I'd violated that by recording conversations and sharing them strategically. I told Genesis she was right that families need spaces to discuss concerns. But those spaces should be about finding solutions and offering support, not about entertainment and judgment. The group chat had never been about helping me. It had been about feeling superior to me. The drive home was surreal. 3 years ago, I'd left Dale's house feeling humiliated and betrayed. Tonight, I was driving home from a family dinner where my documentation had exposed exactly what they'd all been doing behind my back. The family joke wasn't laughing anymore. He was the one holding all the evidence. Here's what I learned from this whole experience. Documentation is power when you're dealing with people who lie about their behavior. They can gaslight you about individual conversations, but they can't argue with 3 years of screenshots and recordings. The truth doesn't change just because it's inconvenient for them. The best part is watching them realize that their private cruelty wasn't as private as they thought. They're all paranoid now about what else might be documented, what other conversations might surface, what other family members might start keeping records of their behavior. To everyone who followed this story and offered support, thank you. You helped me realize I wasn't overreacting or being too sensitive. When people treat you like entertainment behind your back for years, documenting that behavior isn't revenge. It's self-defense. The family dynamics will never go back to what they were, and that's exactly what I wanted. I'm done being everyone's punchline. From now on, they can deal with the version of me who keeps receipts and isn't afraid to use them. Sometimes the best revenge is just refusing to be the victim anymore.